Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Testing. One, two, three, four. Testing 1, 2, 3, 4. Inshallah, we'll be starting in just a couple of minutes. We'll start at 8:05, inshallah. start, inshallah. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائمة على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. For the hastening in the return of our beloved 12th Imam, please recite another loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah, and hopefully we have benefited very well from the month of Ramadan. As you know, tonight, inshallah, we will continue with the discussion on the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. We were not able to cover the whole story in the month of Ramadan, and so these weeks after the month of Ramadan, we are going to continue discussing the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. As we normally do, I'm going to go through a quick review of where we ended in our last session, where the story ended and where the discussion ended, and then afterwards we will move on with the rest of the story. In between, I'll have a quick pause to commemorate also the upcoming day that we have, which is the 8th of Shawwal, the demolition of the graveyard of Baqi, or the shrines that we had in the graveyard of Baqi. So I'll also be touching on that after I do a quick review of what we discussed so that we understand where we stopped in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. In the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, he was able to interpret the dream of the king. And the king, because he understood this, he told his people to go and get Yusuf from the prison, because Yusuf had not only given the king the interpretation of his dream, he had also proposed a solution to solve the problem that the dream was foretelling. And because of that, the king knew that he was very special. That's why you read in the verses of the Quran that he sent one of his people to go and get Yusuf from the prison. وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ أُؤْتُونِ بِهِ. Go and get him, I need to have him with me. Okay. When this person came to get Yusuf alayhi salam from the prison, and this was the second time that the king was sending someone to Yusuf, because the first time it was that individual who was now making wine for the king and he was coming to get the interpretation. This time, this person is just coming to get Yusuf out of the prison. We read in the verses of the Quran that Yusuf wanted to leave prison, of course, but he paused for a second and he didn't go for that yet, because he wanted to make sure that essentially his reputation is clear and clean from any wrongdoing. And that's why when he wanted to leave the prison, he told the king, and he kind of alluded towards the king, yes, there was this situation where the women of Egypt, they essentially, and Zulaykha specifically, they accused me of approaching her when her husband wasn't around. And in order to clean up this situation and clear it up, he told the king essentially to ask, مَا بَالُ النِّسْوَةِ اللَّاتِي قَطَّعْنَ أَيْدِيَهُنَّ. Go and ask and investigate and figure out what was going on with those women who cut their hands. Go and look into that incident, see what happened there. And of course the king went and did that. He spoke with Zulaykha, he spoke with all of the women, and they all said, قُلْنَا حَوْشَ لِلَّهِ. They said, no, nothing like this happened. And Zulaykha in particular, she said, الْآنَ حَسْحَسَ الْحَقِّ. You know what, after all of these years, essentially the truth has come out now. أَنَا رَاوَدْتُهُ عَنْ نَفْسِهِ. I am the one who approached him, and he kept saying no to me. And he is truthful in what he is saying. Now when this happened, and of course the reputation of Yusuf alayhi salam has now been cleared, right? His past doesn't have this dark spot in it of him approaching Zulaykha. Then the king asked him to come again. وَقَالَ الْمَلِكُ أُتُونِ بِهِ أَسْتَخْلِصْهُ لِنَفْسِي. This time the king said, you definitely have to leave the prison. فَلَمَّا كَلَّمَهُ قَالَ إِنَّكَ الْيَوْمَ لَدَيْنَا مَكِينٌ أَمِينٌ. When he started to speak to him, he said, listen, I trust you, you're a trustworthy individual, because we saw the way you dealt with Zulaykha, even though no one was around, you didn't go for it, number one. And number two, you will have a very special position in this kingdom and in this empire from now on. It is very clear that you have this immense knowledge that we can utilize. And we know, and this is the part where we have to talk about a little bit, we know from the story in the verses of the Quran that Yusuf then said, قَالَ جَعَلْنِي عَلَى خَزَائِنِ الْأَرْضِ. Yusuf then said, well, if I have this knowledge and I'm trustworthy like you're saying, then why don't you put me in charge of this project of guiding the nation of Egypt through this drought that is now going to come. And we know again from the story that the king of Egypt, he went ahead and he did that. Okay, now he became the head of this task force. Of course, because now he is at this high position, this high point in the story of Yusuf, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used that special phrase of his again, وَكَذَلِكَ مَكَّنَّا لِيُوسُف. This is how we positioned Yusuf in the proper places we wanted him to be positioned in. And we said in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, this phrase has been used twice. Once is when he went from the low point of the well to the high point of being in the palace of Potiphar. That's the first time. And the second time is now when he's going from the low point of being in prison to now being in the high point, or at the high point of living in this palace and being essentially the right man person, the right hand person of the king of Egypt. Okay. And then we know that this drought started, and of course Yusuf alayhi salam, he started to prepare things and he started to prepare the people. But because this drought was such an encompassing drought, because it encompassed not only Egypt but even areas and regions outside of Egypt, or maybe this area of Egypt was where the crops were grown and were given to people outside of Egypt. Now the brothers of Yusuf, their village, and Jakub alayhi salam are also being affected by this drought. Now the brothers are now going to come to Yusuf alayhi salam. They are going to ask for this wheat. They're going to ask for food because they know that the capital has someone in charge who has been able to save up this wheat for this critical and this difficult moment. And based on this, we said that we can understand from the time that Yusuf alayhi salam got out of prison and the time essentially that the brothers of Yusuf come to him, there must have been a gap of at least 7 years. Otherwise, it wouldn't have made sense, because the dream of the king told us, and Yusuf told us, that there would be 7 years before the drought would have started. And therefore, if the brothers of Yusuf are now coming and complaining of a drought, then you can tell that there's another 7 years. This is important because now you have to add this 7 years also to this long timeline where Yusuf alayhi salam has been distant and away from his family. The brothers came. When the brothers came, the Quran says, فَلَمَّا when the brothers, yes, if I can find the verse, وَجَاءَ إِخْوَةُ يُوسُف فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ فَعَرَفَهُمْ وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكَرُونَ. That when these guys came, they all did not know that this is Yusuf standing in front of him, but Yusuf alayhi salam was able to tell that these are his brothers. فَعَرَفَهُمْ وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكِرُونَ. And of course they did not know this. It's a beautiful hadith that we mentioned in our last session, as I bring the review to an end, that the 6th Imam explains here the connection between Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam and the 12th Imam. He says the same way Yusuf alayhi salam, he knew where his father was. He knew that he could have approached his father. In fact, he could have told the brothers that he is Yusuf. But essentially there was something that had taught him, there was something that had commanded him from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not do that, and to continue essentially being hidden from his father and his brothers. Now, what was the reason for this and what was the point of it? We'll touch on it today as well, because we'll pose an important question that usually is not posed in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, that will unveil another layer to this story as well. So we'll talk about that. But the hadith continues to explain that the same way that Yusuf could know where everybody was, he knew that these people are his brothers, he knew where his father was. Even though he knew all of that, he could not go and share who he was with them, but yet he was watching the way they talk, the way they walk, the way they give opinions about their brother who they think is dead now. The same way that is happening, the 6th Imam says, this is also how the 12th Imam looks at the people during his time. They can't see him, but he can see them. But he has been ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to not share who he is. And yet, as the hadith says, he walks and he passes by them in the bazaars. He comes across their houses. He comes across their friends, their families, their relatives. But he cannot share who he is. And yet people live their life as if he is not even present. The same way the brothers of Yusuf, in their imagination, they would not have even imagined that their brother was alive, that their brother was right there standing in front of them. This is also how the people approach the 12th Imam. We also assume that the 12th Imam is not around. There is no Imam right now. Whereas the reality, based on this hadith of the 6th Imam, is that no, he's there. And he walks by you and he passes by you. You just don't know who he is. You just don't recognize him. This is where we ended in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. And of course, there's some points that we have to go back on and touch on. But before I continue, I just want to take a couple of minutes to also remember and commemorate this incident and this date of the 8th of Shawwal that we know of as the demolition of the shrines of Baqi. I touched on this last night a little bit as well, and I want to touch on it just for a couple minutes tonight as well, that we understand that as followers of the Ahlul Bayt, and even not as followers of the Ahlul Bayt only, but even as Muslims in general, this is an incident, this is something that has happened in history that is of quite a bit of importance. It carries a lot of significance with it. And there's two sides and aspects to this significance. There is the side that really brings tears to your eyes. There is a side that brings pain to your heart, knowing that you have 4 of your Imams buried in the graveyard of Baqi, and none of them have a shrine. None of them have anything to commemorate their presence there. And when you look at other people, when they leave this world, at least there is a stone there that can essentially mention who they are, for example. Mentions 1 or 2 of the services they offered. At least mentions the years they were alive and the years that they left. And when it comes to our Imams, you will struggle to even find that. What you will find is just dirt. And this is the utmost, of course, they think that they're able to disrespect our Imams in this way, and they're not able to. But this is an attempt to disrespect our Imams with whatever ideology there is in this. So there's one aspect of it that brings really pain to your heart. And when you look at the pictures that you have of Baqi over 100 years ago, and you compare them to the pictures of Baqi that our children have had a chance to see, you will find that there is a big difference. And therefore, it is a responsibility of our dear parents to educate their children when it comes to this, so that our children understand that if they are followers of the Ahlul Bayt, and beyond that, if they are Muslims, there are those who don't want you to spread this message. There are those who have this grudge in their heart from the Ahlul Bayt that they cannot even bear the idea of a shrine being there. And yes, there is ideological, essentially, ideological foundation to this. There's a reason why they say the things that they say. There's a purpose and some faith fundamentals for why they say the things that they say and why they oppose a shrine being there. But at the end of the day, for most of them, it is a matter of a grudge in their heart, and is a matter of hatred that is there, a dislike that is there for the Ahlul Bayt. So there is one side of it, of course, that has to do more with the emotional side of it, and that's also important because we have love for the Ahlul Bayt. But there's also another aspect to it, which just has to do with understanding the ideology, the mindsets, the thought process behind this idea that yes, you cannot have a shrine for a human being, because if the shrine is there, for example, this is a form of worshiping this human being. This is a form of speaking to someone who's dead. This is a form of, honoring a person who's dead. And this is a form of shirk, for example. Okay? Now, this discussion is a long discussion, and I don't mean to get into the discussion. And a lot of times, the depth of it is underestimated by our brothers and sisters. It's a deep discussion. It's not one that you can refute with just a couple of hadiths here or there. No, it's a very deep discussion that, of course, our scholars have had and talked about and written about. But it's important to understand that this type of ideology is out there. And this is important also for our children to understand. That a graveyard that was there, that shrines that were there, twice we read in history that they were demolished, that they were destroyed. One earlier on, and now the second time, just about 100 years ago, in the year 1925, if I'm not mistaken, was the second time that this took place. And the third point, and with this inshallah I'll wrap up and move on to the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. The third point to keep in mind is that yes, this is not something that unfortunately sometimes individuals who are a little ignorant, they attribute this to an individual being from the Sunni school of thought. No, this is ignorance, that we would turn towards 80% of the Muslim ummah. We said 80% of the Muslim ummah would be happy and pleased when someone deals with the Ahlul Bayt in this way. This is not the reality of things. No, this is the ideology of a small minority, a loud minority, and a minority that, of course, in Arabia, or what we refer to, unfortunately, today as Saudi Arabia, have power or have had power and authority and have spread their own way of looking at the teachings of Islam. This is something that's coming from a minority, but a minority that has had quite a bit of power. And I encourage our brothers and sisters to really just read the history of this Arabian Peninsula in the last 100, 200 years and see how much it has changed from the way it was before. You know, Arabia wasn't always a region that had this much power and authority, or was this much of a player, I should say, in world politics. It was after the essentially the discovering of oil that things really changed in that area. This is a longer discussion, but just something to really look at and to really understand is just to read the history of what made Arabia the way it is today, and how these individuals that we know of today have authority over there, how they were able to gain this authority and this power in that country, unfortunately. Having said that, let's move on to the story of Yusuf alayhi salam and carry on with the story. The first question that we have to ask in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam is this. We know that this king is, of course, not a prophet of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. We know that he probably is also not a pure individual. It seems as though if he is a king and he has slaves and he has maids and he has servants, and he would be dealing with them in a way that is in many cases oppressing them. And therefore this government is an oppressive government if you think about it at the end of the day. That's why you would have a king normally, right? Because this is a person who simply has usurped the power in the society, and now he rules over people. And therefore the question that comes to mind is, why would Yusuf alayhi salam accept power and authority from a king who is running and functioning in an oppressive government? Why is this the case? And a sign of this and an example of this is what you found with that individual who was accused of killing the king, and how Yusuf alayhi salam interpreted his dream and said that you will never make it out of the prison. They will kill you, they will hang you, and the birds will eat from your head, if you remember earlier on in the story. So why would Yusuf alayhi salam want to work for such a king? And why would he want to essentially be a part of such a government? Of course, things are very different at the time of Yusuf, but I do have to mention this. This is a concept, this is an issue that our scholars and particularly the Ahlul Bayt have talked about quite a bit. We have multiple ahadith about this, and we have verses of the Quran about this as well. That is it allowed for an individual who is a believer to work for an oppressive government? Is he allowed to take on a role where he represents an oppressive government? Is it allowed for him to take on a role where he furthers the oppression of an oppressive government? This discussion is a very complex one, because if we're just going to answer the question in a world where things are black and white, in a world where things are very clear cut, of course everyone would respond and answer to that question and say no to that question. They say no, of course, if you're going to further the oppression of an oppressive government, or even beyond that, if you're going to represent an oppressive government, of course you shouldn't be doing that. It's easy to answer it in that form. But in the real world, of course, when you approach these types of situations, there are times where you being a part of this government or representing this government might bring about some good. It might bring about some goodness that'll come out of it. And that's where things get very complex. It's very difficult to tell when this is allowed and when this is not allowed. Yes, the default ruling that we have from our scholars is that if there isn't no greater good that's going to come out of it, Ayatollah Sistani, Ayatollah Khamenei, other scholars also, they have this opinion, multiple of them have this opinion, that you are not allowed to take on a role where you represent an oppressive government. You are also definitely not allowed to take on a role where you further their oppression or you help them in that oppression, whatever that government might be, right? It might be certain governments that come to our mind, but there might be other governments as well who play that role as well. But then again, how does this play out in our day-to-day life? This is very complex. It is very nuanced. It is not very easy to draw the line. because you also have certain companions of our Imams who played this role. They were used to work as representatives of an oppressive government in the Khilafat of the Abbasids, but then still you find that the Imams not only approved of what they did, they encouraged them because there was a greater good that was going to come out of it. In particular, for example, we read during the time of the 7th Imam with that companion of his, famous companion of his, known as Ali ibn Yaqtin, who was able to help the Shia of his time. So when is it allowed? When is it not allowed? I will just say this because it's a very complex issue, and even my knowledge, or the little amount of knowledge that I have, it is not able to answer this question fully. All I will say is that something we have to be very careful about, something that we have to really think about before we were to ever approach something of this nature. We do have rulings from our scholars that have warned us in this regard. Both from Ayatollah Sistani and Ayatollah Khamenei, you will find these rulings from both of them. So therefore, if you find, now looking in hindsight to the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, if he is accepting authority from this king, then we need to know that for sure he was looking at the greater good that was going to come out of this. What was the greater good that was going to come out of this? On one hand, you find that Yusuf alayhi salam was going to be able to save thousands, maybe millions, we don't know the numbers, of lives from this drought that was going to happen, number one. And number two, what you kind of get a glimpse of when you read the history of his story is that it seems as though the relationship that he would build with this king later on in the future was that he was able to use this relationship to propagate the message and the risala of Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. It seems as though that was the case. And some say that it reached a point where the king essentially passed over his powers and authorities, or at least many of them, to Yusuf alayhi salam. That is also what some have said from a historical perspective. And therefore, this is why Yusuf alayhi salam is asking for this authority. Otherwise, if it was just an oppressive government and Yusuf would not be able to use his power for the good that he wants to do, and the good was not this very, very significant good, it wasn't this really, really big good, it was just something small, you wouldn't have found Yusuf alayhi salam working with an oppressive government in this particular manner. Okay, that's one thing we have to keep in mind. Then moving on from that, when Yusuf alayhi salam was set in charge, the very interesting thing that you find in the story of Yusuf is that he planned out his whole strategy. And this is a lesson for us, brothers and sisters, because it shows us that our prophets and our imams, they used to plan things from a strategic perspective. It wasn't that Yusuf alayhi salam said, well, Mr. King, there is going to be this drought. 7 years, there is going to be a good time. We're going to have a good time. For 7 years, there's going to be a drought. But, inshallah, we'll be fine. Is that what Yusuf did? I don't think that's what Yusuf did, right? No, Yusuf alayhi salam, when he knew that this drought is coming, he knew that the threat is very real. What did he do? He started to plan. He started to strategize. And this is a lesson for us, because this planning and looking at things from a strategic perspective is something that we essentially lack in our communities and in our families and in our culture, unfortunately. You find this in different ethnicities in different ways, where sometimes brothers and sisters, sometimes you will see a younger individual, sometimes an older individual, it doesn't matter. They have this sense of relying on Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala automatically means that He will take care of everything, that everything will be fine, that inshallah the events will unfold and everything is going to be fine. Yes, that's after you do your planning though. That's after you sit down and strategically think about everything. Did Yusuf alayhi salam sit there and say, inshallah things will be fine, don't worry about it? No. He planned for it and he strategically thought about it, and then yes, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala helped him. And this is what you find also in the seerah of our imams and the seerah of our Prophet salawatullahi alayhi. When you look at Imam al-Hussein salawatullahi salamuhu alayhi, you find little glimpses of it here and there. And of course, history, when it comes to recording what happened to our Imam, to the third Imam, of course history has not done justice. History has not even come close to doing justice in recording the details of the incident of Karbala. But some glimpses you find of it here and there. For example, in that story of Karbala, what you find is that the night before, we have hadith that the Imam, he was sharpening his sword for the battle that was going to start the next day. And we know, of course, that the third Imam, at this point at least, when 72 of his people are only left, or maybe more, and 72 of them are going to become shaheed, of course he knows that he's not going to leave this battlefield. That's what he had told his people already. And yet you find he is planning for the next day. He is preparing for the next day. And then beyond that, the way he set up these tents, right? What you find in the story of Karbala on the day of Ashura is that the tents were set up in such a way where there was a fire in the back of them. The tents were set up in such a way where they were closer to each other so that it was a closer knit type of atmosphere, and that only the front was open so that if the attack was going to happen, it would only happen from the front. And then the way the Imam managed the whole scene of Karbala, there was a lot of planning that went into it. Of course, not planning the way you and I plan, but there was strategic thought that went into it. This is a lesson for us. And then you also find this in the life of the Prophet salawatullahi alayhi, that when he wanted to go about challenges, when he wanted to go about dealing with a certain situation, it's not that na'udhu billah he would just put his head down and say, inshallah, God will take care of it. No, and a very good example of this is the Battle of Uhud, that, you know, that bitter moment in Islamic history that taught the Muslim Ummah so many different lessons. What you find in the story of Uhud, the Battle of Uhud, is that the Prophet had prepared very well for it, in fact. He had planned things out very well. Now, of course, people didn't act upon it, but that's not because the Prophet didn't plan for it. In fact, what you read in that story is that before the battle started, the Prophet started to give a little bit of a talk, a little bit of a lecture in order to have his people ready. Did he sit there and say, well, the people have belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so they'll be fine? That's not what he said. He said, no, let me speak to them. Let me help them from a morale perspective, right? He delivered a lecture as he would normally do before a lot of battles that he had. And then beyond that, when he observed the army of the enemy, again he planned for this, and he took 50 of his archers and he put them up on the mountain. And when you look back in history, this line has been narrated from the Prophet, that he told them, these 50 individuals that were in that strategic position, he turned to them, he said, listen, it does not matter if they defeat us and we are losing the battle until a point where they have pushed us all the way back to the city of Medina. Still, you will not leave your position here on the mountain. And it also does not matter if we are so victorious that we have pushed them all the way back to Mecca. Still, you will not leave this moment and this position. What does that show you? That shows you that our Prophet, he planned for things strategically. He thought about things. Why do we know this? Because we know that the Muslims had left the city of Medina in order to come and confront the kuffar outside of the city of Medina in the Battle of Uhud. He said, listen, even if we're losing so much that our backs are against Medina, like they pushed us back all the way till Medina, or we are victorious to a point where we have pushed them all the way back to Mecca, of course this is metaphorical speech, then you are not to leave your position. And of course, when the Muslims didn't act upon it, we know that what happened in history and how essentially the fate of that battle was changed because these individuals did not act upon it. But this doesn't show you that the Prophet did not plan for it. No, the Prophet planned for it very beautifully. Of course, the Muslims, they didn't act upon it. So this idea of planning for things is also of a high level of importance and significance. You find this in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. You find that he is planning. Therefore, for us, especially our youth, we are not to live our lives in such a way where we just allow events and incidents to happen to us. No, you're supposed to plan for it. Yes, life will happen at times, but if you plan for it, even when it happens, sometimes you'll give yourself an advantage to react in a better manner as well. You are to plan for your career. At least you try to think about it. You may not know exactly how your career is going to essentially play out, how it's going to pan out, yes. But do you take the time to think about it, give it thought, consult those who have been in different careers? Maybe this is the career you want to go into. Maybe that's the career you want to go into, right? Think about it and have that sense of responsibility, of concern. Or do we just sit there and say, well, nothing comes to my mind. So inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of it. Which one of it is it? And then beyond that, someone who plans for their career, how much do we plan for our akhirah? How much do we plan strategically? If I'm going to remove this habit of mine from my life, how am I going to plan strategically so I can place myself in a situation where I can make myself less vulnerable to this sin? That's part of leaving sin. Leaving sin, and I've talked about this before, doesn't mean that you're like Yusuf in the palace of Zulaykha, spending time with Zulaykha day and night, and then when that that ultimate showdown shows up, then you're able to walk away from it. No, sometimes you have to plan for this beforehand. Yusuf was stuck in that palace, but you and I, no, we can plan for this a lot of times. You know, for example, that if you go and spend time with a group of friends of yours, you know what's going to happen. You know, if you send that text message, if you make that interaction with that individual, that it's going to lead to certain things. Well, then you plan for it. You plan for a situation where you're not tempted to end up in these situations. Not that you just allow life to happen to you, and then when you make a mistake, you say, well, this mistake happened. Well, yes, the mistake happened. But what you need to do from now on is plan for it. Planning for our careers, beyond that, planning for our akhirah. What happened in this month of Ramadan? How are you going to spiritually lift yourself after the month of Ramadan? These are things that we have to plan for as well. This is the second lesson that we can learn from this part of the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. I'm going to move on a little bit faster so that we can, inshallah, cover more of the story. So when these brothers came, وَجَاءَ إِخْوَةُ يُوسُفَ فَدَخَلُوا عَلَيْهِ فَعَرَفَهُمْ وَهُمْ لَهُ مُنْكِرُونَ. He, of course, turned to them. وَلَمَّا جَهَّزَهُمْ بِجَهَازِهِمْ. When he saw that they are in need of this wheat, what did Yusuf alayhi salam tell them? He told them, قَالَ أَتُونِي بِأَخٍ لَكُم مِّنْ أَبِيكُمْ. That brother of yours that you were talking about, and of course he was referring to Binyamin, that brothers of yours that is a brother of yours through his father, or through your father, because we know that Binyamin came from a different mother. That brother of yours, أُتُونِي, why don't you bring him to me, right? I need to see him. And it kind of seems as though from the story that when Yusuf alayhi salam says, bring that brother of yours to me, it seems as though they were the ones who shared with them or with him that they had this other brother. Because it seems odd that Yusuf alayhi salam would say this and they would not be able to figure out that this is Yusuf alayhi salam. It seems as though they were sharing this information with him, and when they mentioned that, then he said, you know what, bring that other brother of yours, right? Bring the 11th of yours with you so that I can see him as well. Okay. And then in order to make sure that these guys would do this, Yusuf alayhi salam did two different things. He said what? أَلَا تَرَوْنَ أَنِّي أُوفِي الْكَيْلِ وَأَنَا خَيْرُ الْمُنزِلِينَ. Don't you guys see that when I was measuring the wheat that I wanted to give you, the way I was dealing with you, the way I was treating you, I did it in such a fair manner. Ufil kail means that I fulfilled everything when it comes to measuring your wheat. Wa ana khairul munzilin, and the way I honored you guys were my guests. You guys came from a far way. I honored you. I gave you a great place to stay. Because of this, this is the first incentive that he used in order to get them to bring their younger brother. That was number one. Number two, the second thing that he did, he said, فَإِن لَمْ تَأْتُونِ بِهِ. If you do not bring your younger brother with you this time, فَلَا كَيْلَ لَكُمْ عِنْدِي وَلَا تَقْرَبُونَ. If you don't do it this time, then guess what I will do? This time I'm not going to be just and I'm not going to be fair. وَلَا تَقْرَبُونَ. And in fact, I will tell the guards to not even allow you into this land of Egypt. They will stop you right at the gates. They won't even allow you to come inside. So he used both the idea of how nice he was to them and also this small threat just so that they would listen to him, just so that they would go back and bring Binyamin with them. What did they do? قَالُوا سَنُرَاوِدُ عَنْهُ أَبَاهُ وَإِنَّا لَفَاعِلُونَ. They said, yes, of course. You were so nice to us. We will make sure to ask our father, but not just once. We will ask him multiple times. For those who remember, the word murawada in Arabic, it refers to the idea of asking something over and over again. That's why when Zulaykha approached Yusuf, right, and the Quran says وَلَقَدْ رَاوَدْتُهُ, or it says وَلَقَدْ راودته التي هو في بيتها عن نفسه, the Quran used the word murawada. We said that this means Zulaykha had been approaching Yusuf over and over again. Here again, these brothers say, Sanurawidu, we will ask our father over and over again until he says okay, until he accepts this request. Okay. وَقَالَ لِلْفِتْيَانِهِ اِجْعَلُوا بِضَاعَتَهُمْ فِي رِحَالِهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَعْرِفُونَهَا. What did Yusuf do as a third incentive? He said, you know what I'm going to do in order to be super kind to them so that they feel the need of coming back towards me, is that whatever they paid for the wheat, because they had brought something to pay for the wheat, even though it might have not been too much money, but they did bring something for wheat to buy the wheat. He said, whatever they brought, whatever money they brought, put it back in their wheat. So when they go back and they're with my father Jakub, they start going through the wheat, they actually figure out that this wheat consists of their own money. Their own money is returned to them. So essentially, they didn't pay anything. They're walking back with free wheat, which is essentially such a huge currency right now because there is a drought everywhere. How would someone be so kind to give you the wheat that you need and also give it to you for free? You're not even being charged anything. So Yusuf used multiple incentives to get them to come back. Okay, now what we read in the story is that, of course, they went to their father and they told their father, "Oh, father, we, of course, we have been told that we are not going to be given wheat anymore and that we have to take our brother." I want to end with this point. This is a very, very critical point in the story of Yusuf because this is the point that a lot of people don't really pay attention to. The question is this: what is Yusuf doing here? Why is he even asking for them to bring their younger brother? When we look at the story of Yusuf, we assume that the main theme of the story is how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has Jakub over here on one hand. He has Yusuf over here going through the ups and downs of life, the low points of his life and the high points of his life, and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to bring about a moment where these two are going to join one another. They are going to reconnect with one another. That's the main theme as far as we look at the story of Yusuf alayhi salam. We look at it and we say, when are these two individuals going to get back together? And of course in the story we know that that moment happens. So then why is it that as this is unfolding now, and now that Yusuf is even closer to meeting his father, what's this part of the story have to do with all of this? That now Yusuf alayhi salam is coming up with this clever way to have his brother leave his father and come and join him in Egypt. What's happening here? This is a question, this is a part of the story of Yusuf that we normally don't pay a lot of attention to. And it's worthy of asking this question. Why? Why is Yusuf complicating things so much? Someone might say, well, he wants his father to come to Egypt, and the only way that will happen is that if he has Binyamin there with him as well. But that's not true. If Jakub knows that Yusuf is in Egypt, if Jakub knows the one, his son, who he has been crying for day and night, is in Egypt, you don't think he's going to leave Canaan and leave and go to be in Egypt with his son? Of course he would do such a thing. So why is it that Yusuf is playing this plan and essentially going about this planning in such a way to get his brother there with him? What's going on? What's the thought process of Yusuf alayhi salam? If you think about it, you find that as much as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is managing the overall theme, the main theme of this story, which is Jakub reaching a point where Yusuf is able to meet him and they are able to see each other, you also find that on the other hand, while Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is managing all of this and the 100,000 things that have to go right for this to happen, on the side he is also managing the spiritual growth of Jakub alayhi salam. Why is this? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is looking at Jakub and he is seeing that Jakub has been going up the ranks from a spiritual perspective. Why? Because he's been tested with the absence of Yusuf. He's been tested with not having Yusuf around while knowing that Yusuf is alive. So Jakub is growing. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to test him with another test. You would assume that once you pass one test, you would just rest. But with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is so merciful when it comes to His servants. He wants to elevate His servants, especially His prophets, as much as He can. Jakub, you were patient when we took Yusuf away. Well, great. You have been growing spiritually, but let us test you even more. You have more potential. Let us bring you up higher even more. Now that Yusuf is not around anymore and you are crying but you're patient at the same time and you are doing sabrun jameel, let's test you with this also. Let's also take Binyamin away from you. This is another test that's happening in the life of Yaqub alayhi salam. And it seems as though Yusuf alayhi salam has been commanded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to play a role in having this test take place for his father. Otherwise, what other reason was there for Yusuf alayhi salam to insist in such a way and have the Quran talk for multiple verses about it, about how Yusuf is going to get his brother all the way from Canaan to Egypt by the right side of his? What is the point of all of this? Why is Yusuf insisting on all of this? Did he miss his younger brother? Well, if he missed his younger brother, he could have just gone and visited his father. He could have just gone and visited his younger brother. It seems as though this is another test Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is putting in the life of Yaqub to elevate him even more. And the reason why we say this is because when the brothers of Yusuf came back this time, and this time they said Binyamin was also taken from us, and Binyamin is not with us anymore. You find in the verses of the Quran, Yaqub said what? وَابْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. Yaqub, this time it was too much for him. He started to cry. This time he lost his eyesight. Essentially, this was a test upon a test for Yaqub alayhi salam. This is how you find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala managing the whole story of Yusuf alayhi salam, but at the same time, he is teaching smaller lessons. He is giving smaller tests to his prophet to elevate his status. As much as he is managing 100,000 other things to happen in the story, he also wants Yaqub to grow spiritually as much as he can. And even though he has already been tested with such a big test, he wants to add to his test a little bit more. Yaqub, when we took your Yusuf, you only complained to us. Well, let's do something else. Let's add to this test of yours. Let's take it up a notch. Now we're going to take Binyamin away as well. What are you going to do now? And what did Yaqub say? قَالَ إِنَّمَا أَشْكُو بَثِّي وَحُزْنِي إِلَى اللَّهِ. I will only complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And as the verses say, وَبْيَضَّتْ عَيْنَاهُ مِنَ الْحُزْنِ وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. He was so upset and he was so sad that he lost his eyesight because he was crying so much. وَهُوَ كَظِيمٌ. But at the same time, he was able to control his emotions while he was going through all of this. So it's interesting how you would assume that the story will end now. Yes, Yusuf, come meet Yaqub. Everything is going to be fine now. But no, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has one more lesson to teach Yaqub and one more test to put in front of him so that he will grow even more than he has already grown. This is probably the reason why Yusuf alayhi salam is coming up with this plan to bring Binyamin to Egypt. Inshallah, with that we will end. Next Friday we'll talk more about this, and we'll also talk about what happened when the brothers of Yusuf, when they went back to their father and what their father had to say. A little bit of it we touched on as we were ending tonight, but we'll go into more detail about it, inshallah, next week. Let's take a moment to recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat, and as well as all of the marhumin and marhumat of all of the believers all of the world, inshallah. بالنبي وآله رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة مع الصلوات. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.